A young black girl goes missing, only to be discovered in the basement of her seemingly innocent neighbor. As the police investigate, disturbing evidence is found that raises more questions than answers. What was she doing there? And what dark secrets will the police uncover when they dig deeper into the lives of those involved? Before we dive into this incredible story, comment below where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy the story. Now let's get started. Lila Thomas had always been a quiet, obedient child. Her neighbors would often say how lucky her parents were to have such a sweet girl, never causing trouble, always with her head down. But something changed the night she went missing. It had started as an ordinary evening. Tina Thomas, Lila's mother, had cooked spaghetti for dinner while her husband Marcus sat at the kitchen table, reading the news on his tablet. Lila had finished her homework early and retreated to her room after dinner. By 8:30, Tina had tucked her into bed, planting a soft kiss on her forehead before flicking off the light. "I love you, baby," she whispered. "I love you too, Mommy," Lila responded, her voice small but steady. That was the last time Tina saw her daughter that night. Hours later, when Tina went to check on Lila before heading to bed herself, her heart stopped. Lila's bed was empty, the covers thrown to the side. Panic set in as she rushed to the window, realizing it was wide open, the curtains billowing in the cool night air. She called for Marcus, her voice shaking as she pointed to the window. "She's gone, Marcus, she's gone." Tina's voice cracked as the weight of the situation hit her. Marcus didn't waste time. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his voice urgent as he reported their daughter missing. In the following hours, the neighborhood became a sea of flashlights and concerned faces. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers came out to help search for the missing girl, calling her name into the night air. But Lila was nowhere to be found. Days passed and hope began to dwindle. The police had combed through every possible lead, but they found no trace of Lila. The Thomases were beside themselves with fear, sleepless and fraught with worry. The once peaceful neighborhood now felt haunted, the silence heavy with suspicion. Rumors spread quickly. Had she been kidnapped? Was there a predator lurking in their midst? People whispered behind closed doors, their eyes darting toward Mr. Parker's house, the quiet, eccentric man who kept mostly to himself. It was on the third day, just when everyone's hope was about to run dry, that an officer, patrolling the area for what felt like the 100th time, noticed something strange. A faint, musty smell seemed to be coming from the basement of Mr. Parker's house. The officer paused, his brow furrowing as he tried to place the source. Mold? Rotting wood? Something wasn't right. He called for backup, and with a search warrant in hand, the officers entered Mr. Parker's basement. What they found made their blood run cold. Lila was there, curled up on an old mattress, her clothes dirty, her face pale. She looked small, fragile, but she was alive. Relief washed over the officers as they gently carried her out. But alongside that relief came something darker. Suspicion. How had she ended up here? And why hadn't Mr. Parker come forward? The man was immediately arrested, his hands cuffed behind his back as he shouted his innocence. "I didn't know she was there. I swear I didn't know." But to the police, it didn't matter. A missing girl had been found in his home, in his basement. There was no other explanation that made sense. The neighborhood was in an uproar. The sight of Mr. Parker being hauled out in handcuffs sent shockwaves through the community. Parents who had once exchanged pleasantries with him now crossed the street when they saw his house. He had always seemed a bit strange, kept to himself, wasn't very social. But this, no one saw this coming. Tina and Marcus could barely contain their rage. The relief of having their daughter back was overshadowed by the fury of knowing she had been found in the home of a man they had lived next to for years. How could he have done this? How could he have hidden her away without anyone noticing? The police, too, were convinced they had their man. But as they processed the scene, things started to take a strange turn. While searching Mr. Parker's basement, they discovered something odd. Cameras. Mounted along the walls, their lenses were covered in dust, but they were clearly functional. The officers exchanged confused glances. Why would someone like Mr. Parker need cameras in his basement? And what exactly had he been filming? The equipment was bagged as evidence and brought back to the station. The following day, the detectives sat down to review the footage, expecting to find something dark, something incriminating that would confirm their suspicions about Mr. Parker. But what they found only deepened the mystery. The footage started out slow and uneventful, showing nothing more than the blank walls of Mr. Parker's basement. Days passed, and then weeks, with no sign of Lila. Instead, what the cameras captured was the slow, creeping growth of black patches on the walls. Mold, one of the detectives murmured, perplexed. The footage continued, documenting the gradual decay of the basement. It became clear that this was some kind of time-lapse project, an artistic experiment in capturing the passage of time and the slow, inevitable destruction that comes with it. But as they fast-forwarded through the footage, something changed. About 3 days before Lila had been reported missing, they saw her. She appeared on the screen, slipping quietly into the basement. There was no sign of Mr. Parker. She wasn't being forced or coerced. She had come there of her own free will. The officers were stunned. Why would she come here? And what was she hiding from? As they replayed the footage, piecing together the timeline, it became clear that Mr. Parker hadn't known Lila was in his basement. She had snuck in and hidden there, unnoticed, while he went about his life upstairs, oblivious to her presence. The police knew they had to handle the situation delicately. They brought Lila in for questioning, sitting her down in a quiet room at the station. She looked small in the oversized chair, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. Her parents sat on the other side of the glass, watching, their faces tense with worry. The detective, a kind-eyed woman named Officer Reed, sat across from Lila, offering her a soft smile. "You're safe now, Lila. No one's going to hurt you, but we need to understand why you ran away, okay?" Lila hesitated, glancing down at her lap. Her fingers twisted together nervously. "It's okay," Officer Reed reassured her. "You can tell me anything." Lila's voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "I didn't want to stay home anymore." Officer Reed nodded encouragingly. "Why not? Were you scared?" Lila bit her lip, tears welling up in her eyes. She glanced briefly at the glass window, knowing her parents were watching, before she spoke again. They hurt me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "When I don't listen or when I don't do things right, they hit me." The confession hung in the air like a lead weight. The truth finally revealed. Lila's small frame seemed to shrink even further under the weight of her words, and Officer Reed's heart ached for her. Outside the room, Tina and Marcus sat frozen. Tina's face had gone pale, her hands trembling. Marcus, on the other hand, stood abruptly, his fists clenched in denial. "She's lying," Marcus growled, his voice low and dangerous. "She's just a kid. She doesn't know what she's talking about." But deep down, Tina knew. She had seen the bruises, the way Lila flinched when Marcus raised his voice. She had chosen to ignore it, to believe it was just discipline. But now, hearing her daughter's trembling voice, the truth was undeniable. Officer Reed pressed on, her voice soft but firm. "Lila, why did you go to Mr. Parker's house? Were you trying to hide?" Lila nodded slowly. "I heard him say once that he didn't care about people's business. I thought, maybe he wouldn't care if I stayed there. I just didn't want to go back home." Tears finally spilled down Lila's cheeks as she finished her story. The room was silent, except for the quiet sniffles of a little girl who had been carrying too much for too long. While the officers processed Lila's confession, they still needed to clarify Mr. Parker's involvement. He had been taken into custody when Lila was found, and though the cameras painted a different story, they still needed to hear from him. Mr. Parker sat in the interrogation room, looking more tired than anything else. His gray hair was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from a night in the station's holding cell. Officer Reed entered, taking a seat across from him. Her demeanor remained neutral, but her eyes held the slightest edge of curiosity. "Mr. Parker," she began, "thank you for your cooperation. We've reviewed the footage from your cameras. It seems like Lila entered your basement on her own, without your knowledge. But we still need to understand why you had those cameras in the first place." Parker sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. "I'm no criminal," he muttered. "Those cameras were part of a project. I'm an artist, officer. The basement had developed a serious mold issue, and I wanted to capture the decay. It was an experiment, a time-lapse for an art piece I've been working on for a while." Officer Reed raised an eyebrow. "An art project?" "Yes," Parker nodded. You can check my files. I've got documentation, sketches, everything. I've been fascinated by how time changes things, how even a building can rot away slowly when neglected. The cameras weren't there for anything sinister, I swear. Reed leaned back in her chair, her expression softening. The explanation was strange but plausible. Still, there was another piece of the puzzle that needed to be addressed. Lila said she was running away from her parents. Did you ever notice anything strange about her home life? Parker's eyes shifted slightly, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. I heard things, yes. I never saw anything directly, but I heard them arguing, loud voices, a lot of shouting. I didn't want to get involved. I'm not the type to meddle in other people's affairs. His voice trailed off, guilt creeping in as he realized that perhaps, by doing nothing, he had inadvertently allowed the situation to escalate. I heard her cry sometimes, he added quietly, but I didn't think it was my place to interfere. Officer Reed took a moment to absorb his words. While his decision to stay silent wasn't illegal, it did add another layer to the growing picture of Lila's home life. And despite his reluctance to get involved, Parker's testimony only confirmed what Lila had already revealed. Her home was not a safe place. Reed finished the questioning and stood up, nodding to Mr. Parker. Thank you for your honesty. We'll be in touch. As she left the room, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the man. He had been dragged into a situation he hadn't asked for, and his quiet, solitary lifestyle had suddenly become a public spectacle. But at least now, the truth was starting to surface, and the real culprits, the ones who had hurt Lila, were finally in the spotlight. With Mr. Parker cleared of suspicion, the focus shifted back to Lila's parents. Tina and Marcus had been taken into separate rooms for questioning. Their reactions couldn't have been more different. Tina, pale and trembling, sat nervously in her seat, her hands fidgeting in her lap. She had always been the quieter of the two, the one who went along with Marcus's rules, never wanting to rock the boat. But now, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights of the police station, she felt her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Mr. Parker, she began, thank you for your cooperation. We've reviewed the footage from your cameras. It seems like Lila entered your basement on her own without your knowledge, but we still need to understand why you had those cameras in the first place. Parker sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. I'm no criminal, he muttered. Those cameras were part of a project. I'm an artist officer. The basement had developed a serious mold issue, and I wanted to capture the decay. It was an experiment, a time-lapse for an art piece I'd been working on for a while. Officer Reed raised an eyebrow. An art project? Yes, Parker nodded. You can check my files. I've got documentation, sketches, everything. I've been fascinated by how time changes, how even a building can rot away slowly when neglected. The cameras weren't there for anything sinister, I swear. Reed leaned back in her chair, her expression softening. The explanation was strange, but plausible. Still, there was another piece of the puzzle that needed to be addressed. Lila said she was running away from her parents. Did you ever notice anything strange about her home life? Parker's eyes shifted slightly, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. I heard things. Yes. I never saw anything directly, but I heard them arguing. Loud voices, a lot of shouting. I didn't want to get involved. I'm not the type to meddle in other people's affairs. His voice trailed off, guilt creeping in as he realized that perhaps, by doing nothing, he had inadvertently allowed the situation to escalate. I heard her cry sometimes, he added quietly, but I didn't think it was my place to interfere. Officer Reed took a moment to absorb his words. While his decision to stay silent wasn't illegal, it did add another layer to the growing picture of Lila's home life. And despite his reluctance to get involved, Parker's testimony only confirmed what Lila had already revealed. Her home was not a safe place. Reed finished the questioning and stood up, nodding to Mr. Parker. Thank you for your honesty. We'll be in touch. As she left the room, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the man. He had been dragged into a situation he hadn't asked for, and his quiet, solitary lifestyle had suddenly become a public spectacle. But at least now, the truth was starting to surface, and the real culprits, the ones who had hurt Lila, were finally in the spotlight. With Mr. Parker cleared of suspicion, the focus shifted back to Lila's parents. Tina and Marcus had been taken into separate rooms for questioning. Their reactions couldn't have been more different. Tina, pale and trembling, sat nervously in her seat, her hands fidgeting in her lap. She had always been the quieter of the two, the one who went along with Marcus's rules, never wanting to rock the boat. But now, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights of the police station, she felt her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "I didn't know it was this bad," Tina whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know she felt like she had to run away." Officer Reed, sitting across from her, gave a small, sympathetic nod. "Tina, you need to be honest with us. Lila has already told us what happened at home. We need to understand your side of things." Tina took a shaky breath. "It wasn't always like this. When Marcus and I first got married, he was different. He was loving, kind. But over the years he changed. He started getting angrier, more controlling. When Lila was born, he said he had to be strict with her. He said it was for her own good." Tears welled up in Tina's eyes, and she wiped them away quickly. "I didn't agree with how he treated her, but I was afraid to speak up. I thought if I just stayed quiet, things would get better. I didn't realize how much it was hurting her." Reed let Tina's words sink in for a moment. "Did you ever try to stop him?" Tina nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "A few times, but Marcus, he wouldn't listen. He said I was too soft, that I didn't know how to raise a child properly, and I believed him. I thought maybe he was right, that I wasn't strong enough." In another room, Marcus was a stark contrast to his wife. He sat rigidly in his chair, his arms crossed, a defiant scowl on his face. He had already made it clear he didn't want to cooperate. "This is ridiculous," Marcus spat. "My daughter's a liar. She's trying to turn everyone against me. She needs discipline, and I'm the only one in this family who knows how to give it to her." The officer across from him didn't flinch. "Mr. Thomas, your daughter has told us that you've been physically and emotionally abusive. We're giving you the chance to explain yourself." "Abusive?" Marcus scoffed. "That's a joke. I disciplined her. That's what a father's supposed to do. If she can't handle a little tough love, that's her problem. This whole thing is blown out of proportion." But the officer remained calm. "Mr. Thomas, we have reason to believe that your discipline crossed the line. Lila ran away because she felt unsafe in her own home. Do you deny that?" Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence spoke volumes. The truth had finally started to unravel. Lila's story, backed by Mr. Parker's testimony and Tina's confession, painted a grim picture of life inside the Thomas household. The police knew they couldn't let Lila go back to her parents. Marcus's temper and Tina's complicity had created an environment of fear and control, and it was clear that Lila needed a safe place, away from them. In the next chapter, the final pieces would fall into place. Lila's grandparents, who had always been there for her when her parents weren't, would come forward to offer her the love and stability she so desperately needed. And as for Marcus and Tina, they would face the consequences of their actions in a courtroom. But for now, the little girl was safe. The darkness that had loomed over her life was beginning to lift, and for the first time in a long time, Lila felt like she could breathe again. The police station was quieter than usual as the final pieces of the investigation fell into place. Officer Reed had just finished briefing Lila's grandparents on the situation, and they were now in the family room, waiting to see her. The air was heavy with anticipation, but there was also a sense of relief, knowing Lila was finally safe. Lila's grandparents, Evelyn and Charles, had always been a steady, loving presence in her life. Though they lived a few hours away, they had visited regularly and had always offered Lila a refuge when things got tough at home. They hadn't known the full extent of what had been happening, but now, seeing the toll it had taken on their granddaughter, they were determined to make things right. "She's been through so much," Evelyn said, her voice shaky with emotion. "How did we not see it sooner?" Charles placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We can't change the past, but we can give her a better future. That's all that matters now." As they waited, Officer Reed walked Lila into the room. The little girl looked smaller than ever in her oversized hoodie, her eyes still red from crying. But when she saw her grandparents, a flicker of hope lit up her face. "Grandma, Grandpa," she whispered, rushing into their arms. Evelyn held her tightly, tears tears streaming down her face. "Oh, baby, we're so sorry. We're going to take care of you now, I promise. You won't have to go back there." Lila buried her face in her grandmother's shoulder, letting the warmth of their embrace chase away the cold fear that had gripped her for so long. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe. Officer Reed cleared her throat softly, reminding them of the reality that still needed to be addressed. "Lila, I know this is hard, but we need to talk about what happens next. Your parents are going to be facing legal consequences for what they've done, and we'll need your help to make sure the truth comes out." Lila pulled back from her grandparents slightly, looking up at Officer Reed with wide, uncertain eyes. "What's going to happen to them?" Reed knelt down to Lila's level, her voice gentle but firm. "Your parents are going to go to trial. They'll have to answer for the way they treated you. But you won't be alone in this. Your grandparents will be with you every step of the way, and so will we." Lila nodded, though the weight of the situation was still hard to grasp. She knew things would never be the same, but maybe that was for the best. As Reed spoke to Lila, Mr. Parker stood quietly at the back of the room, watching the reunion unfold. He had been released from custody earlier that day, after the police cleared him of any wrongdoing. Though relieved, he couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at him for not speaking up sooner about the things he'd heard from Lila's house. It was Evelyn who noticed him first. She approached him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Mr. Parker," she began softly, "thank you for helping Lila. I know this wasn't easy for you either." Parker shifted awkwardly, his hands deep in his pockets. "I didn't do much," he mumbled. "I should have said something sooner." Evelyn shook her head. "You didn't know, but you've been good to her. We appreciate everything you've done." Parker nodded, still feeling the weight of his inaction, but grateful for her kindness. "I'm glad she's going to be okay," he said quietly. As Lila and her grandparents prepared to leave the station, there was still much to be done. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and the trauma of her experiences would take time to heal. But surrounded by love, Lila felt a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. In the weeks that followed, her parents would face trial, and the truth about what had been happening behind closed doors would be exposed for all to see. Lila would testify, telling the court how she had been treated, while Mr. Parker's testimony would add weight to her claims. The cameras that had once been part of an art project had captured something far more important, the truth. And that truth would finally set Lila free. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. I put a lot of love and care into telling these important stories, and your support means the world to me. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time. Have a blessed day.